It's my pleasure now to welcome to the stage Jason Clark, Director of Climate Change Advocacy for the Insurance Bureau of Canada, who's going to introduce our minister and get our program started today. Jason.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you, Shirley, for the kind acknowledgement of the land. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous. I'm very pleased to be with you at such an important time for our country. My name is Jason Clark. I'm the National Director of Climate Change Advocacy for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. We are the National Industry Association for the property and casualty insurers across the country. I'm also the chair of Climate Proof Canada, a national coalition of Canadian business, disaster relief organizations, municipalities, Indigenous organizations, NGOs, and think tanks that believe Canada must prepare for the present and growing effects of climate change through building a more disaster-resilient country. To begin, I would also like to acknowledge that my family and I live, work, and play on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Again, thank you, Shirley. As our little guy said to me when smoke blanketed Ottawa earlier this summer, "Dada, it smells like camping." 6,100 fires, over 15 million acres burned across virtually every region of this country, more than 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions released into the atmosphere, equivalent to the global emissions annually of the airline industry. This wildfire season has shattered previous records and 10-year averages. Every year, we experience new and often historic wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, and storm events exacerbated by climate change. In 2022, insured losses from extreme weather and climate-related events hit $3.4 billion, making it the third worst year for insured losses ever in Canadian history. Canada is becoming a riskier place to live, work, and insure. Following this wildfire season, real concerns have emerged about the continued insurability of areas of the country that face repeated climate-related events. Now, I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the firefighters and thank them, especially those that have given their lives to protect us, our children, our families, and our communities. Also, in advance of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we must acknowledge that climate-related disasters have a disproportionate impact on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, as well as populations experiencing vulnerability. Repeatedly, we have seen that Canada is not prepared for the climate impacts we are already experiencing, let alone what is to come. But no matter our background or our political affiliation, we can all agree that more must be done now to protect our children, our families, and our communities from these impacts. There is good news. Thanks to the leadership of the Honourable Steven Guilbeault, his office, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, we have a world-leading national adaptation strategy with actionable targets to track progress. Now, we need to ensure we're making the necessary investments and programmatic changes to effectively implement the NAS. The Honourable Steven Guilbeault is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Member of Parliament for Laurier-Sainte-Marie since 2019, a lifetime environmental advocate, the co-founder of Equiterre. He's also served as the Minister of Canadian Heritage. I want to personally thank the Minister for this cross-government effort to ensure that Canada is better prepared for, responsive to, and recovering from natural catastrophes. As our little guy has taught me, we need to address these impacts that are already locked in. We have a critical opportunity for everyone to work together to address this moment. Please join me in welcoming Minister Guilbeault.
Thank you very much, Jason, for this kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Permettez-moi également de reconnaître que nous sommes réunis sur le territoire non cédé de la nation Algonquin-Anishinaabe. Je remercie le Club canadien d'Ottawa de m'avoir donné l'occasion de prendre la parole ici, à l'hôtel historique Château-Laurier, un moment aussi important de l'histoire de notre pays et en fait un moment crucial pour l'humanité et la planète. Summer has just officially ended in Canada, and what a summer it was. Record wildfires that forced tens of thousands of Canadians from their homes and blanketed large parts of North America and even parts of Europe in smoke. Record heat, deadly flash floods, ocean warming that fueled, for the first time ever recorded, Category 5 storms in all 7 of the world's ocean basins. The impacts of climate change have arrived. And as a father and a public servant, I sit up and take notice. But at the same time, something else transformative is happening. Investment in clean energy is booming. Clean tech is growing exponentially. Breakthroughs in battery storage. Other technologies like AI are opening new horizons, and just retrofitting our industries will drive jobs and growth for decades. Without questions, government have a big role to play, and we need to have an adult conversation about climate change and climate policy in Canada. I want to tell you a story. Last week, during Climate Week at the UN in New York, I was at an event with West Kelowna Fire Chief Jason Brolin. Chief Brolin vividly described the trauma of fighting this summer's massive wildfires, of sending his team into danger, of fighting to protect homes and lives. It was a miracle that no one died there. He called it once-in-a-lifetime fire, and then told us how it was, in fact, the second once-in-a-lifetime fire he faced in 20 years. That is the impact of climate change. Chief Brolin said another thing that stuck with me. He said West Kelowna spent more than $20 million battling this summer's wildfires, and insurers' losses will triple that amount. What could we have accomplished if we've used the same amount of money proactively? Those are Chief Brolin's words. He said money spent fighting fires is spent on the wrong end of the problem. So when we talk about climate change and climate policy and affordability, let us base our discussions in reality. I invite everyone to join these conversations. Politicians, business people from Bay Street to the oil patch to the mom-and-pop dépanneur in Trois-Rivières, Indigenous nations, journalists, scientific community, non-governmental organizations, students and teachers, truckers, tradespeople, and travelers. We all have a stake in getting climate policy right. But is that even possible in a time of echo chambers and bumper sticker slogans and misinformation and conspiracy theories? Okay. I realize it's a pretty heavy opening, but avoiding the reality of climate change is not going to make it go away. Whoever follows, whatever government, they will still be dealing with climate change in the next decade and beyond. That's the maddening thing about some of today's circular arguments, deflections, deceptions, and denials that make up too much of the public debate about climate policy. To use a hockey analogy, it's ragging the puck. Take the example of pollution pricing, one of the most cost-effective tools we have to fight climate change. What does it do? It incentivizes clean technology innovation, energy efficiency, and puts more money back into people's pocket with rebates. You will never hear some critics mention those rebates. An era of emission? But you'll hear an awful lot about inflation and climate and carbon pricing. Ask a Bank of Canada about inflation, and they'll tell you pollution pricing isn't driving it. Or consider a government's draft clean electricity regulations, currently out for public comment. We propose that all new gas-fired electricity generation after 2035 will require carbon capture technologies, with few exceptions. Yet, I keep seeing critics falsely claim that we're banning all gas generation by 2035, upon threat of jail time. This fabrication is not designed to inform. It is designed to inflame. But while fact-checkers play whack-a-mole with misinformation and insults around climate change, the cost of inaction keeps rising, a debt to our kids and grandkids that too few politicians talk about. You do not have to take my word for it. The world's steely-eyed bean counters, the World Bank, the IMF, insurance bureaus, investment funds, they all say the same thing. Delay on climate action costs us exponentially. As BlackRock CEO Larry Fink told his shareholders last year, and I quote, "We're interested in sustainability not because we're environmentalists, but because we're capitalists and fiduciaries to our clients." Il y a plus de 20 ans maintenant, j'ai escaladé la tour du CN pour attirer l'attention sur la crise climatique. Aujourd'hui, d'une manière ou d'une autre, les changements climatiques retiennent l'attention de tous et toutes. Et chaque mesure que nous prenons pour réduire les GES aidera les futurs dirigeants du Canada et les familles à éviter d'accentuer la crise climatique dont les coûts s'alourdissent d'année en année. Chaque fois que nous détournons l'attention, que nous nous enfonçons dans la désinformation ou que nous retardons l'action climatique, nous augmentons le fardeau et compromettons la sécurité de ceux et celles qui nous succéderont. Alors, ayons des conversations raisonnées sur l'action climatique. Canadians have a lot on their plates. There's a lot going on in their lives and big world of instability out there. Canadians are concerned about the cost of living, and rightly so. Global inflation spurred by the COVID pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and Russia's illegal aggression has put a strain on households. Climate change makes all these problems worse, and we cannot put climate change policy on the back burner while we deal with these other major issues. Because at the same time we face these escalating climate catastrophes, we're making huge breakthroughs in low-cost solar and wind, energy storage, zero-emission vehicle technology, heat pump sales, hydrogen, biofuel, green steel, and aluminum. We have the solutions, but do we have the collective will to pursue them at the pace and urgency required? The Government of Canada now, for a couple of years, been doing a study of Canadians' attitudes towards climate change. This research suggests that Canadians consistently underestimate our collective desire for climate action. Fully 3/4 of us believe climate change is a threat that requires urgent action, and yet Canadians, when asked, estimate that fewer than half of us believe this. There's also a big disconnect between the willingness of Canadians to act compared to their belief in the willingness of others to act, a 30% gap, in fact. So it seems that Canadians really do want climate action, but a noisy minority of climate deniers has managed to dominate the public discourse, and that has wide-ranging repercussions. For almost 8 years now, the Government of Canada has challenged the brightest minds in the country. For 8 years, we've turned over every rock looking for ways to cut Canada's carbon pollution and clean our air and water, while growing our economy, providing good jobs, and building out affordable, reliable, clean energy. And here's something I'm absolutely certain I do not say often enough. Between 2019, when Canada's pre-pandemic economy was in full swing, and 2021, where our economy started to get back on its feet, Canada's overall carbon pollution fell by 53 million tons. That's the equivalent of taking 11 million gas-powered cars off Canada's roads, or more than half of all Quebec's emissions. In both 2020 and 2021, the last years for which we have full emission reports, Canada has had the best performance in terms of greenhouse gas reduction of all G7 countries. With the return of full employment and a revived oil and gas sector in 2022, emissions may rebound somewhat in the next report. But the trend line is clear. We have decoupled economic growth from pollution, and we're now on the march to sustained emission reductions. Our government's climate policy can be viewed as 3 intertwined branches, one supporting the other. First, nature-based climate solutions, including our 2 billion tree program and commitment to protecting at least 30% of lands and oceans by 2030, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, provinces, and territories. 30 by 30 became a global target when we brought the world together last December in Montreal and helped broker an historic global biodiversity deal. We now recognize that protecting nature and fighting climate change go hand in hand. 2, as Jason was talking about, Canada's first national adaptation strategy and the Government of Canada climate adaptation plan that goes with it. And I really want to extend a warm thank you to the Insurance Bureau and Climate Proof for being such an integral part of our national adaptation strategy. From better flood mapping to improved building codes to fire prevention, from building more resilient infrastructures to community protections, from extreme heat and to understanding erosion and melting permafrost. We're on it. And three, and perhaps most importantly, our emissions reduction plan, sector by sector, which lays out optimal emissions reduction determined by the most cost-effective reductions through our economy. This includes everything from retooling our transportation sector with zero-emission vehicle sales targets and EV charging stations. It includes industrial policy on things like batteries and critical minerals, an historic investment in public transit, including zero-emission buses. Our plan includes billions of dollars to support clean electricity and more efficient and reliable grid, and builds on the successes we've seen with the coal phase-out to the last mile and make Canada's grid fully net zero by 2035. It includes world-leading methane reduction, clean fuel regulations to encourage biofuels and build out charging infrastructures, pollution pricing so that it is no longer free to pollute anywhere in Canada, combined with quarterly household rebates that return money back to Canadian families. Our measures include funding for heat pumps and home retrofits and zero-emission vehicles rebates and charging stations. It includes billions for heavy industry to decarbonize. It includes eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We're the only G20 country to have done so, and coming soon, a cap on the emission of the oil and gas sector. I could speak to you at length on each and every one of these important climate measures that the government has enacted or very actively pursuing. But then we would be here at least until next Tuesday. My point is this: environmentally sound economic decisions help convince other economic decision makers. Investment choices influence other investors. And choice by choice, decision by decision, we're bending the curve on Canada's pollution and the fight against climate change, while maintaining and building a strong Canadian economy. From support for the Come By Chance biodiesel refinery in Newfoundland and Labrador, to the Cemex biomethane plant in Varennes, Quebec, to the Oneida battery storage project in Ontario, and Indigenous-led solar projects in Alberta, clean energy investments mean good jobs and clean air. Et voici la bonne nouvelle. Le Canada, ce pays riche, en pleine croissance et exportateur de pétrole et de gaz, a réussi à infléchir la courbe de ses émissions. Je crois que ceci est digne de mention. En 2015, le Canada était sur une trajectoire insoutenable de hausse de la pollution carbone. Mais de 2019 à 2021, les années les plus récentes pour lesquelles nous disposons de comptabilisation complète sur les émissions, le Canada a enregistré la meilleure réduction de GES de tous les pays du G7. But there is also much noise and misinformation out there on how Canadians supposed to know we are making progress. I'm not naive. I know that good news is a tough sell. Stories on climate-fueled natural disasters, from floods to wildfires, dominate our news, followed by day-to-day pocketbook concerns, all fanned by deniers who seem willing to burn the house down just so they can occupy the foundation. Well, Mr. Poilievre, as a career politician, you must know that this is a global crisis, one that has been mounting since you started collecting a public salary 2 decades ago, and will still be with us in your feverishly imagined future. The 75% of Canadians who are concerned about climate change and want action should know that our hard-won progress can only continue with sustained work and commitment. Slowing and reversing climate change is a generational battle, and any charlatan who comes along promising quick fixes can set progresses back by years, even decades. Let me be clear. In the last federal election, Conservatives, including Mr. Poilievre, campaigned on a platform that included pollution pricing and a clean fuel standard, very similar to the one our government enacted. It wasn't much, but it was at least an acknowledgement of the issue. Today, they say that they're adamantly opposed to both these climate measures. Mr. Poilievre claims he wants to address the climate crisis through technology innovation, yet he's against a simple market-based and economy-wide incentive that is driving innovation, pollution pricing. He opposes investments in electric vehicle plants. He opposes EV purchase incentives. He clearly doesn't believe in EVs are part of the solution. He also wants us to cut back in public transit support and wants to deregulate the oil and gas sector. The political tactic that Mr. Poilievre views, the partisan hardball that gives rise to the disregard of the environmental commons, is also driving the disregard of all commons public goods: universal health care, vaccination, harm reduction, our social safety net. The casual disregard of facts and science in pursuit of partisan advantage goes beyond the climate change issue. It becomes an issue for the health of our democracy, of all democracies. If we have to have our own sets of facts, how do we choose policy responsibly? I wish there was an easy answer, a magic bullet that could stop climate change in its track. Instead, we are stuck with the laws of physics and the reality of a big, sparsely populated and resource-dependent nation. Our climate plan is working. There's much to do still, but we are heading in the right direction at long last after much hard work. We must continually challenge ourselves to do more, not less, because no amount of misinformation can change what we have accomplished. The challenge now is to ensure progress doesn't slip away in smoke. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Minister. I'll just briefly invite Shawn McCarthy to the stage. As I introduced him earlier, Shawn McCarthy was a longtime scribe for the Globe and Mail, I think an acknowledged leader in climate reporting during much of that time, and so we're very pleased to have him for this conversation with the Minister. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, Minister.
Shawn?
I hate to date us both, but I knew the Minister when he was still climbing buildings in Toronto and covered him when he started Ecoterre, was a prominent spokesman for Ecoterre in Quebec. So it's good to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Affordability, it's almost certainly the biggest political issue in Canada right now, and is increasingly the battleground where you're fighting the climate debate. So let's unpack that a little bit. Why are your critics wrong when they say, as a executive with a Calgary-based utility did this week in the Globe and Mail, that we are not taking into account enough the high cost of transition?
Well, I think we, in an ideal world, and I understand we don't live in an ideal world, but we wouldn't try and pit an issue like affordability against climate change. Because the reality is that, and Jason talked about it, climate change is going to cost Canadians more and more. They don't get, they don't get a bill at the end of the month saying, this is your climate change bill for this month, but we're all paying it, and we will continue to pay more and more unless we find ways to tackle our emissions. And I think there are many benefits. In fact, I was seeing today an article in the Toronto Star about a new study by Clean Energy Canada that shows that going off oil for an average household would mean monthly savings, so fully off oil in terms of transportation, home energy, heating, could save on average a household in Canada about, or in Ontario, about $800 per month. So there is a clear good business case for people. I think the challenge now is we're implementing some of those measures, deploying some of those measures. For example, heat pumps in Atlantic Canada, where we find a lot of people still using home heating oil. And obviously the increased cost of home heating oil in Atlantic Canada has not much to do with carbon pricing and has a lot to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But that's not how certain politicians are presenting it for their own political purposes. So I think it's important to, even if it is difficult politically, to state a course. And I think we can always adjust our measures. You can always do better from a public policy perspective. But I think these are good measures. I was talking about New York last week at Climate Week. We had an event where the head of the IMF, the head of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, both came to sing the praises of Canada's pricing system as a model that should be followed by many. And in fact, more and more are adopting carbon pricing, a form or another of carbon pricing around the world.
The government has long argued that carbon pricing is a critical part of the agenda to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, but the Americans aren't using carbon pricing, federally at least. There is some in California and some in different states on the electricity side, but a broad carbon price of the type Canada has is not being deployed in Canada. So are they wrong?
Oh no. Let's not. What I'm about to say should stay in this room, please. But I go to Washington from time to time, and I meet with U.S. politicians and U.S. senators, and often, more than once, I've had U.S. senators apologize to me for not being able to do what Canada was doing to fight climate change. They would love to be able to put in place a form of carbon pricing, and in fact, through the Inflation Reduction Act, which has not much to do with inflation and a lot to do with transition, they have actually introduced a form of what we call here an OPBS, so an output-based pricing system. Like they kind of slipped it through the back door, so they are starting to do it. But I've had seriously a number of U.S. senators say, "Oh my God, if we can only do what Canada's doing on this." I think there's a lot of, and frankly, both. I mean, not a whole lot of Republicans have said that to me, but some, and quite a few Democrats.
You mentioned your visit in New York, and when the Prime Minister was in New York, Undersecretary General Melissa Fleming called out Canada for having among the largest expansion of oil and gas production in recent years. So, you know, a lot of people see that as contradictory in terms of Canada's claim to be a climate leader. You know, how do we justify that claim that Canada is a climate leader when we are expanding oil and gas production at a fairly rapid clip?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that the Secretary General invited Canada to speak at the Climate Ambition Summit. We were one of only 30 countries invited to speak, and I think it is in recognition of the things we are doing, despite the fact that we are a large oil and gas producer, or maybe because we are a large oil and gas producer. Canada was the only large oil and gas producer invited to speak last week. The US weren't, China wasn't, India wasn't, Norway wasn't invited to speak. We were. I think as a recognition of what we're doing, first G20 country to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, what we're doing on methane, we will get to at least 40% methane reduction in the oil and gas sector by 2025, and we have a 75%, at least 75% target for 2030, which makes it one of the most ambitious in the world, and we're a large oil and gas producing nation. The increase we're seeing in production last year is obviously not the result of decisions that were taken last year or the year before, but decisions that were taken 8, 10 years ago, as you know. And there is this challenge in Canada that the federal government does not control the use of natural resources, which is why we're going after methane, which is why we're doing clean electricity regulation that is focused on the emissions of the electricity sector, not what kind of electricity mix provinces choose to use, which is why we're putting a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sector, because this is something we can't, as a federal government, control, but we can't control the use of natural resources.
I wanted to, that was a perfect segue into the questions around the cap. We have been told that to expect regulations, draft regulations this summer. This summer ended last week. What's going on with the regulations, and when do we expect to see them?
It's taking a bit longer than I would have liked, but the Prime Minister last week in his speech at the United Nations said that we would have the draft regulations by the end of the year. So it's coming.
Why is it taking longer than you would like?
Why is it?
Yes.
We're the only country in the world that I know that is trying to do that. So there's not a whole lot. We're basically writing the book on this. So it's a complex piece of regulation. If members of the Environment and Climate Change Canada were here, they would probably tell you that the minister is very demanding of them. So in the last year, we've adopted clean fuel regulations. We've renegotiated carbon pricing with every single jurisdiction in Canada. We published draft regulations for a zero emission vehicle mandate, so ZEV. In last December, we will have final regulations by COP in the coming weeks. Draft clean electricity regulations, eliminated fossil fuel subsidies. I'm probably forgetting one or two things. So there's a lot happening in the department. It's taking a bit more time, but it was a commitment we took during the 2021 election. It's in my mandate letter, and the Prime Minister reiterated last week that it's coming.
Okay, one last question on this, and then a quick one to end it. But do you have any hope that you can bring the Alberta government and industry, which says your goals are too much, that it's not they can't do it without cutting production? Do you have any hope of bringing them on side?
I mean, my personal preference is always to try and work in collaboration with whether it's private sector, provinces and territories. Unfortunately, it's not always possible right now in Canada. As a nation, imagine what we could do if we're all rowing in the same direction. And we're not, but despite that, we're seeing tremendous progress. Alberta, what's been happening on renewable energy and clean technologies, like 70% of renewable energy investment last year happened in Alberta. It boggles my mind a little bit that the Premier would put a cap on economic and job creation development. I really don't understand that. So we will do what we have to do to achieve, within obviously the means that we have, to ensure that Canada achieves its 2030 emissions cap. Not because, it's something one morning we got up and decided to do, but because that's what science demands of us. A country like ours should reduce its emissions by at least 43%, so we're at 40 to 45% by 2030. And the only way I can go and sit down with the Chinese or the Indians or other nations and say, let's work together to find solutions to this complex problem, like we did in Montreal last December, is by doing it ourselves. We have to preach by example. Otherwise, what kind of credibility would Canada have on the international scene when it comes to try and find international solutions to these problems?
I'm told that that's all the time we have. We could sit here all afternoon. I'm sure. Well, you couldn't. I could. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shawn.
Well, that wraps up our program for the day. I would like to thank everyone for joining us. My name is Heather Bach, and I'm a partner at Pendulum, and I had the pleasure of serving as president of the Canadian Club from 2019 to 2021. I would encourage you, well, first of all, I want to thank the minister as well. I know you have a very tight schedule, and it's been a very busy week, so I appreciate you taking the time, and I know you have a heart out, so I hope you enjoyed the event today. The Honourable Steven Guilbeault has been in this role, I believe, for nearly 2 years, but you've essentially lived this file your entire adult life, right? So, as a modern environment minister's responsibilities are incredibly complex. contrasting it to what this same portfolio had 20, 30 years ago. He has to deal with what we heard today are complicated regulations, the impacts of climate change, and the transition of Canada's economy in a variety of sectors. That's pretty hefty stuff. He has a lot on his plate, and his familiarity with this very complex file is evident. So thank you for sharing some of your insights and knowledge with us here today. I would also like to thank the moderator, Shawn McCarthy. Shawn was a global energy reporter, and his grasp of the industry, of the implications of climate change, and the promise of renewable energy technologies. He was a first adapter on all of this, and I believe that his knowledge and expertise is second to none in the country. And as a fellow colleague on the board of World Press Freedom Canada, as misinformation came into this, I will say that Shawn makes the case for beat reporters. When we have people who know how to question and know how to follow up on questions, we're all in a better place in our democracy. So thank you very much, Shawn, for being the heart and soul of World Press Freedom Canada and our today's moderator. Again, I would like to thank the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Jason Clark, thank you for joining us here today. We really appreciate your support. When we have our discussions that are at the intersection of business and government, we can't do it without the support of the private sector and public sector. So we appreciate your support here today and hope that you found value in it. And I would like to just let you all know, okay, so this is a season launch. We have an amazing program this season. A lot of things are lined up. We do have early bird tickets, and they're at a very good price, and I guarantee the next one's going to sell out fast. It is called Partners in a Changing Economy and World. The keynote is His Excellency David L. Cohen, the UN Ambassador to Canada. He's a big draw, and he will be talking, will be complementing today's discussion actually, focusing on the ties between our two nations and how we are seeking to spur massive investments in low emissions and next generation technology, friendshoring, manufacturing, critical minerals, and creating meaningful growth that benefit workers, business, and investment. Our collective global leadership has never been more important. So please do join us. That's on Halloween, so you can come and have lunch before you get into your costumes. And I would just say we have a fantastic season ahead. Thank you, Jeff, for organizing today's event and for everyone who's joining us. And I would just ask the head table to please join us for photos on stage and hope to see you on Halloween, everyone else. Thank you once again.